January 7th, 1945, Belgium. The Ardennes forest is buried under 3 feet of snow. Somewhere in those frozen trees, the bodies of American boys are still being dug out. 19,000 of them will not be going home. The Battle of the Bulge has been raging for 3 weeks, the bloodiest American battle of the entire war, and the men who survived it are still fighting. But inside Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's press tent, the atmosphere is almost cheerful. Montgomery stands before the microphones without notes. He has been talking for an hour. The cameras flash. He is describing the battle the way a surgeon describes a complicated operation that went well, with clinical satisfaction, with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing at every moment, with the unmistakable implication that without his intervention, the patient would have died on the table. He tells the reporters it was one of the most interesting and tricky battles he has ever handled. He says, "As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself." He says, "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies." He says, "I put it into the battle with a bang." The word "I" appears so many times in his account that the journalists scribbling in the tent begin to lose count. He mentions American troops once. Briefly, he says they fought well. He does not name a single American commander. He does not mention Patton, whose Third Army turned 90 degrees in winter conditions and drove 100 miles north to break the siege of Bastogne. He does not mention the 101st Airborne, which held Bastogne for 8 days surrounded, outgunned, and running out of everything except the willingness to fight. He does not mention the 99th Infantry Division, which held the northern shoulder of the Bulge at Eisenhower Ridge, under conditions that military historians still study as one of the great defensive stands of the war. In Montgomery's account of the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans were there. They fought. He saved them. 300 miles away, at Supreme Allied Headquarters in Versailles, a transcript of the speech is being placed on Eisenhower's desk. Eisenhower reads it once, then he reads it again. The men around him later described what they saw as a rare and alarming thing. Eisenhower, who had spent 3 years absorbing every insult Montgomery had offered with the patience of a man who understood that coalition warfare required him to swallow things that should not be swallowed, was visibly, physically angry. His hands were not quite steady. To understand why this particular press conference was different, why this one, after everything that had come before, was the one that broke something, you need to understand what had happened in the 6 weeks before it. December 16th, 1944. 200,000 German soldiers erupted out of the Ardennes forest in the largest German offensive since 1940. The attack hit the weakest point in the Allied line. 4 American divisions stretched across 80 miles of forested terrain that the intelligence assessments had declared a quiet sector. Within 48 hours, the German offensive had split Bradley's 12th Army Group down the center. The 1st Army and 9th Army, north of the German penetration, had their supply lines and communications to Bradley's headquarters in the south severed. Bradley, physically separated from 2 of his 3 armies by the German advance, could not command them. Eisenhower made the decision on December 19th, at the emergency conference in Verdun. He transferred command of all American forces north of the Bulge, the 1st Army under Hodges, the 9th Army under Simpson, approximately 250,000 American soldiers in total, to Montgomery. It was a sound operational decision. Unity of command in a fluid situation required one person managing the northern front. Montgomery was the senior Allied commander in the north. The logic was clear. The politics were brutal. For Omar Bradley, giving up his men to his British rival in the middle of the worst crisis of the American army in Europe felt like a public announcement that the Americans had failed. For the soldiers of the 1st and 9th Armies, Men who had fought their way from Normandy through the hedgerows and into Germany. Men who had watched their friends die for every mile of it. Being placed under a British commander felt like something they did not have clean words for. Montgomery swept into the U.S. First Army's headquarters at Chaudfontaine on December 20th. The accounts of what happened in that room have been described by American officers in memoirs written over the following decades, with a consistency that suggests they are essentially accurate. Montgomery arrived with the energy of a man who had been waiting for this moment. He looked at the defensive plans the American staff had been working on. He rejected them. He began reorganizing. He spoke to generals who had been commanding divisions in combat since June 1944, as though he were a senior officer explaining fundamentals to junior officers who had not yet earned the right to have opinions. "I shall tidy up this mess," he reportedly said. The American generals in the room said nothing. They were under his command. They obeyed. But they were watching, and they were remembering. Montgomery refused to travel to meet Bradley, forcing the American commander to come to him, a protocol reversal that every professional soldier in the room understood, and none would forget. When they met, Montgomery was, by Bradley's account, condescending in a way that went beyond the professional. He lectured. He simplified. He explained things that Bradley had understood for 20 years, in a way that made clear Montgomery considered him a student rather than a colleague. Bradley ground his teeth. He said nothing. He called Eisenhower afterward. His voice, by Eisenhower's account, was controlled in the specific way that very angry men speak when they are controlling themselves in front of others and do not yet have the privacy to stop. Then came January 7th. The press conference was not, by Montgomery's own later account, intended as the attack it was received as. He said he had called it partly to defend Eisenhower. British newspapers had been criticizing the Supreme Commander for allowing the German offensive to succeed, and Montgomery believed a statement from him would put those criticisms to rest. The intention may have been generous. The execution was catastrophic. Because here is what Montgomery could not see, even with decades of experience reading men and situations. The Americans were not angry at Eisenhower. They were not looking for reassurance from Montgomery. They were grieving. For 19,000 dead, for 2 regiments of the 106th Division captured in the opening hours, for the men of the 101st who had held Bastogne on Christmas Day, with frostbitten feet and rations running out. They were proud of what they had survived and what they had done. And they turned on their radios and read their newspapers, and found a British field marshal explaining how he had arrived and organized everything, and employed his forces with a bang. Alex Kershaw, in his History of the Battle, described Montgomery's account as painting a picture of massive American blundering. Only when he had been brought in to command the armies holding the northern shoulder had catastrophe been averted. That is what the Americans heard. Whether it was what Montgomery intended is irrelevant to what happened next. Bradley called Eisenhower. The conversation, reconstructed from the accounts of both men and the staff officers who were present, lasted less than 15 minutes. Bradley's message was direct. If Montgomery was not removed from command of American forces, not eventually, not after a review, immediately, Bradley would resign. He would leave the command. He would go home. Patton, when told, said he would resign alongside Bradley. 2 of the 3 American Army Group and Army commanders in Europe were threatening to walk out 11 weeks before Germany's final collapse. Eisenhower was alone in his office. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. What he wrote was a cable to the combined chiefs of staff, the joint British-American body that held ultimate authority over the Allied command in Europe. The cable laid out, in the precise and unemotional language of military correspondence, the state of the command relationship. It described the breakdown of trust, It explained why the current situation had become operationally unsustainable. And then it stated, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that the combined chiefs of staff would have to choose. Either Montgomery's attitude changed, completely, immediately, and visibly, or Eisenhower would resign. Not request a transfer, not recommend a restructuring. Resign. The mathematics of that ultimatum were simple and devastating. Eisenhower commanded 4 million Allied soldiers. He had the full confidence of Roosevelt and Marshall. He was, by any measure, the most powerful military figure in the Western Alliance. Montgomery commanded a British Army group of roughly 500,000 men in one sector of a 1,000-mile front. If the combined chiefs had to choose between them, there was no choice. Eisenhower showed the draft to Freddie de Guingand, Montgomery's own chief of staff, who happened to be at SHAEF headquarters that day. De Guingand read it. Later accounts describe him going pale, not pale in the way people describe alarm, pale in the way people describe a man who has just read a document that ends someone's career and understands, with complete clarity, that there is nothing standing between that document and Montgomery's future, except the next few hours. De Guingand asked Eisenhower for time, hours, not days, hours. Eisenhower gave him until the following morning. De Guingand drove through a blizzard. That detail matters, not as color, but as evidence of urgency. The roads between SHAEF headquarters and Montgomery's tactical command post were not safe in a Belgian winter night in January 1945. The fighting was ongoing. The weather was brutal. De Guingand drove anyway. He found Montgomery in his tactical trailer, the converted vehicle that Montgomery used as his mobile command post, decorated with photographs of enemy commanders he had defeated, maintained according to his precise personal routines. Montgomery went to bed at exactly the same time every night. He did not drink, he did not smoke. He kept his own hours and his own rhythms, regardless of what was happening around him. He was, by several accounts, in good spirits when de Guingand arrived. The press conference had gone well. The journalists had been attentive. He had made his points clearly. De Guingand did not sit down. He told Montgomery, directly, without preamble, that Eisenhower was going to fire him, that the cable to the combined chiefs was drafted, that it would be sent in the morning, unless something changed before then, that the something that needed to change was not a policy position or a strategic disagreement, but the fundamental question of whether Montgomery understood that he had just publicly humiliated the Army of America's senior partner, 11 weeks before the end of the war. Montgomery laughed. Not for long. De Guingand told him what was in the cable. He described the specific language. He described the look on Eisenhower's face when he handed over the draft. Not angry, past angry, into the cold and final place that men go when they have made a decision they will not reverse. He told Montgomery something else, that the proposed replacement, if it came to that, was Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, a man the British Army respected, a man the Americans could work with, a man who did not make American generals feel like students who had failed their first examination. The combined chiefs, de Guingand said, would not fight for Montgomery if Eisenhower made the case against him. The laughter stopped. What happened next, in the silence of that trailer, with the Belgian winter outside and de Guingand standing across from him, is described in Montgomery's own memoirs with a brevity that suggests it was not something he found it easy to write about. He sat down. Montgomery, who had spent the entire war operating from the position that his military judgment was superior to that of almost everyone around him, who had demanded total control of Allied ground forces, who had sent his chief of staff to conferences rather than attending himself because he considered the process beneath him, who had communicated with Eisenhower in a register that fell somewhere between instruction and condescension, sat down in his chair and tried to understand what had happened. He had miscalculated. Not a tactical miscalculation, not a strategic error, a human one. He had looked at Eisenhower and seen a political figure, a consensus builder, a man whose genius was management rather than warfare. He had concluded, from this assessment, that Eisenhower would absorb anything, that the political requirement to maintain the alliance gave Montgomery a protection that was effectively unconditional. He had been wrong. Eisenhower was a political figure, and political figures understand, with precision that purely military minds sometimes miss, exactly when a situation has moved past the point where politics can protect you. Montgomery had crossed that point on January 7, 1945, in front of a room full of journalists, by describing an American battle as though it had been his personal achievement. The letter arrived on Eisenhower's desk the following morning. It was handwritten, Montgomery's hand. Dear Ike, I am distressed that my recent letter may have upset you, and I would ask you to tear it up. You are the boss, and I support you absolutely in everything you do now, and in all the decisions you take. I am your very devoted subordinate, Monty. Your very devoted subordinate. The man who had spent the entire war communicating with the Supreme Commander in a register that suggested he considered himself the superior officer was writing the words very devoted subordinate. He meant them, not because his assessment of his own abilities had changed. Montgomery would go to his grave believing he was the better commander, but because de Guingand had made the situation clear in the only terms that cut through. The war was not over. Germany was not defeated, and without Eisenhower's support, Montgomery would watch the final campaign from the sidelines. He wrote the letter, and he meant every word of it. Eisenhower read it at his desk. He did not gloat. He did not share it with the American generals who had been demanding Montgomery's removal. He put it in his files and drafted a reply. Professional, warm enough to close the immediate crisis, distant enough to make clear that something had permanently changed. The firing order went into Eisenhower's private file. It was never sent. The alliance held, but the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery after January 1945 was a different thing from whatever it had been before. Functional, correct. The communications between them maintained the forms of collegiality. The forms are well documented. What was gone is harder to document because it left no paper trail. Bradley noticed it first. In the weeks after the press conference crisis, Eisenhower's operational decisions leaned more heavily on the American commanders. When the Rhine crossing came, Patton's opportunity at Oppenheim was allowed to develop without the fuel restrictions that had strangled his operations the previous autumn. When the race into Germany accelerated in March and April 1945, the American armies were given the speed they had been asking for since the previous summer. Montgomery noticed it too. In March 1945, anticipating that his army group would lead the final drive into northern Germany, he issued orders to his own army commanders for operations eastward, without waiting for Eisenhower's approval. He sent Eisenhower a message informing him of the orders he had already given, adding that he hoped to drive toward Berlin by Autobahn. Eisenhower's response was to redirect the main Allied effort away from the northern axis. The American 12th Army Group under Bradley would drive through the center of Germany. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would protect the northern flank. Montgomery would not be going to Berlin. He spent the final weeks of the war clearing the Netherlands and driving to the Baltic. Important operations, not nothing, but not the triumphant final act he had anticipated. He accepted the assignment. He had learned, in the hours between de Guingand's arrival at his trailer and the moment he picked up a pen and wrote, "Your very devoted subordinate," exactly how far his autonomy extended. The historiography of January 7, 1945, has been contested ever since. The British version, supported by Montgomery's own memoirs and by some British military historians, holds that the press conference was misunderstood, that Montgomery was defending Eisenhower against British press criticism, that he praised American troops, that the American reaction reflected a sensitivity born of their own embarrassment about the intelligence failure that allowed the Bulge to happen. The American version holds that the press conference was exactly what it looked like: a British field marshal describing an American battle as his personal achievement in front of an international press corps, without naming a single American commander, 11 weeks before the end of a war in which American forces were carrying the overwhelming burden of the fighting. Both versions contain truth. What the historical record cannot dispute is the arithmetic. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, approximately 75,000. British casualties, 1,406. The proportion of American soldiers fighting on the northern flank that Montgomery commanded versus the British soldiers under his command, overwhelming. The number of American commanders Montgomery named in his press conference, 0. Churchill stood up in Parliament on January 18th and said, "For the record, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses." He called the Battle of the Bulge the greatest American battle of the war. He said this because it was true, and because the Prime Minister of Great Britain had to stand in the House of Commons and publicly correct his own field marshal to prevent the alliance from fracturing. Montgomery kept his command. He kept his stars. He was promoted to field marshal, the highest rank in the British Army, before the war ended. He was at the German surrender at Lüneburg Heath on May 4, 1945. He accepted the surrender of all German forces in the Netherlands, Northwest Germany, and Denmark. It was a significant moment, properly his, and the photographs of it are real. What is also real, after January 7, 1945, the operational decisions that shaped the final months of the war were made by Eisenhower, with a weight on the American side that was not there before. The firing order that Eisenhower never sent sits in his personal papers at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. De Guingen's drive through the blizzard. Montgomery in his trailer, the laughter stopping. The pen moving across the paper, your very devoted subordinate. These things are there if you look for them. They don't appear in the official histories. The official histories are about the battles. This is about the night the battle inside the alliance was decided, and the letter that stopped it, written by hand, delivered before morning, signed by the man who had spent the entire war believing he answered to no one.